For more on this, we'll turn to former UK MP George Galloway. So, George, the breaking news this morning, the Pentagon confirming they're sending some 3,000 U.S. troops to Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe on top of the 8,000 troops at the ready. What do you make of this?
Well, if I was Russia, I'd send the same number of troops right now to Cuba, to Venezuela, to Nicaragua, maybe even to Iran if Iran wanted, strengthening in its defenses. You know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And the United States throwing its forces around the world must accept and expect one day for the countries on the receiving end, principally Russia and China, to repay the favor. If you don't understand that, you're simply illogical and in thrall to American exceptionalism. But I think you can look forward to more of this, Manila.
Yeah.
The last time I looked, I don't think he looks. I'm not sure he's able to. Joe Biden's popularity is falling off a cliff, as is Vice President Kamala Harris. So this really is wag the dog. The more you fall in the polls, the more of your young men and women you send potentially into harm's way.
Yeah, George, the Kremlin has repeatedly asked for, and now we have it in writing, for de-escalation between Moscow and NATO. But the U.S. has not only ignored those requests of disallowing Ukraine from joining NATO, there are no guarantees that they'll be prohibited from joining the bloc, but also no promise that they will join either. Jens Stoltenberg seems to have walked back NATO's rhetoric. So, George, is the U.S. then acting alone here?
Yes, I think the differences within NATO have begun to be so sharp. President Macron of France today breaking almost completely with the American rhetoric on Ukraine. Germany refusing people permission to fly over their territory with weaponry to Ukraine and sending helmets as their contribution to Ukraine's defense. Bulgaria, Slovakia, the recent attitude of other countries like Croatia, which was an unexpected breach with the US. One after the other, these countries, two very important ones, three or four less important ones, have made it clear they want no part of this. So, as I predicted to you months ago, actually, Manila, in the end, if there is a war, it'll be a war between the United States and Russia. None of these other armies, if they've got them, are going to be sacrificing their young men at the front.
Now, George, the Pentagon spokesman, John Kirby, he keeps citing Article 5 of NATO, Ukraine not a member state. What threats, then, are Russia posing to actual member states that would warrant a U.S. troop deployment?
None whatsoever. I mean, they don't have the guts to send these forces to Ukraine because I think the American people would not put up with that. The last polls I saw, overwhelmingly the American public wants a deal between the United States and Russia. So they don't have the guts to send them to Ukraine, so they send them to other East European countries with which Russia has no casus belli at all. It's all performative, Manila, and it's theater. But it's dangerous theater because, of course, the point might come that the Russian government decides this constitutes a clear and present danger to them, this build-up of American forces in neighboring countries.
Now, George, speaking of forces, Ukraine has now vowed to give pay raises for its military, and they're aiming to up their troop numbers by some 100,000 over the next few years. Right now, their forces hover just around 200,000. By comparison, Russia's combined forces are over 900,000 active members. That's 1 million people. The disparity is great. Because of that, on Ukraine's part, wouldn't it be wise of them to cozy up to NATO and the U.S.?
Well, it's not that. It's that they're precluded from joining NATO because they have a pre-existing territorial dispute. And by the way, not only one, it's often misunderstood that there's a Romanian minority within Ukraine, which has very serious complaints. There's a Hungarian minority, ditto, very serious complaints, even a Polish minority with complaints. But of course, their big territorial dispute is with Russia. And in 95, NATO is precluded from allowing someone to join NATO if they have a pre-existing territorial dispute, for obvious reasons. NATO doesn't want willy-nilly to be drawn into a war with a neighbor by admitting someone with a territorial dispute to enter its ranks. And so it actually ought to be perfectly simple for NATO to declare that Ukraine will not be allowed to join NATO for the foreseeable future. But they refuse to do that. Ukraine is being used and abused here, spending money it doesn't have on new forces. They've got their cap out on the other hand, begging people for economic, financial help. Ukraine is an economic basket case. Its population has fallen from 53 million to 33 million. Anyone with skills to sell is already out of the country. It's becoming a Potemkin state, and it's being treated with contempt by people who claim to be looking out for it.